It's time now for our Great British debate this hour, and I'm asking, should a life sentence mean life behind bars? Ralph Bulger, the father of the two-year-old baby James, who was killed by two 10-year-old boys back in 1993, awful story back then, has questioned why one of the killers continues to be granted lifelong anonymity. Despite being denied parole in 2020, Jon Venables is now hoping to be granted freedom in a matter of weeks. He was jailed for life, but released on licence with a new identity in 2001. Why are we paying for these people, honestly? But now the 36-year-old, and he's only 36, bear this in mind, so he has got his life still well ahead of him. He was sent back to prison in 2010 and 2017 for possessing indecent images of children. So I'm asking, is our justice system a light touch? And if someone is sentenced to life in prison, should they spend their entire life behind bars? Well, I'm joined now by Chris Daw QC, who's a barrister and the author of Justice on Trial. Chris, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. So just to clarify, because a lot of people hear a life sentence and they think it means someone will spend their entire life behind bars. What does it actually mean in a court of law?
Well, a life sentence means that you will be subject to the sentence of the court for the rest of your life. Some of the life sentence is spent in prison, and the judge sets the minimum amount of time that you will spend in prison. When you reach that point, you can apply for parole, but you won't get parole unless the parole board decides that you are safe to be released and that you no longer represent a danger to the public. But after you're released, you still remain subject to that life sentence. You can have your movement controlled. You can have all manner of different conditions on where you must live, reporting to the probation service, and a whole range of other activities that you can be prohibited from doing. For example, in this case, you could be prohibited from having unsupervised contact with children and a whole range of other protective measures. And if you breach the terms of your licence, as happened in the past with Jon Venables, I think on more than one occasion, you can be returned to prison under that life sentence. And indeed, in theory at least, you could end up being recalled and remaining in prison until you die.
Well, but all at the expense of the taxpayer, of course. You're coming in and out and in and out, and you're doing things, and we put them back in, and then we bring them back out again. And to me, it just seems there were just 61 criminals serving whole life orders at the end of 2021. So there is a thing where you serve a whole life order, but can that mean that whole life in prison, actually in prison, or does that still mean that you are whole life orders that throughout your life you can go back if you breach the conditions with which you're allowed to be out?
No, a whole life order, it means that you'll never be released, and that's reserved for the most serious and shocking crimes. For example, the killer of Lee Rigby and a number of other very high-profile cases in recent times have received whole life orders, and they've become a lot more common. They're set to become even more common, and we are on the trajectory. We're at the very beginning of that trajectory, but we're on the trajectory towards the United States system, where they have 60,000 people serving life without the possibility of parole. And for me, that will be a catastrophic mistake.
Why? Why is that a bad idea? If somebody gets a whole life sentence, or it might even reduce the propensity for someone to commit that crime if they thought that they could be in prison for the rest of their life. A lot of prisoners are coming in and out of prison consistently, and especially if they're doing awful things but aren't as bad, then we're wasting money, taxpayers' money, in a sense, bringing them out, putting all the security. For example, Venables will, once he comes out, new identity, will need to be protected all his life because of his crimes, and will have to be monitored constantly. Whereas if he were in prison, then that would be fine. He can stay there. I'm just disappointed there isn't actually a death penalty. That's where I would go with this. But if they are, I don't see why they should even be let out at all if they've committed such heinous crimes.
You'd give a death penalty to a 10-year-old?
Not a 10, well, but I'd give, for somebody, as a killer, potentially, not as if you're a 10-year-old, you serve your prison sentence. But I would actually keep them in prison for the rest of their lives.
No, she just said no.
I just said no.
But a moment ago you were arguing that he should have had the death penalty when he was 10.
No, I said we should have the death penalty for the most heinous of crimes, but I would absolutely, if somebody, child killers, there would be a death penalty, but obviously you might have to consider how old that child killer is. And yes, but I wouldn't allow them to come out of prison at all, no. Especially if they've been viewing pornography in terms of child indecent images of children after they've after the sentence. It's not acceptable.
Let's just break all of this down, okay? So first of all, you were a moment ago suggesting that it would be cheaper to keep people in prison the whole time rather than them coming out on licence and going back in again. That's just patent nonsense. It costs an absolute...
Well, why is that nonsense? No, I don't think it is.
Because a high security prison place for a murderer costs anything from £60,000 to £70,000 a year. Keeping someone on probation in the community costs 10% of that. So it's much, much cheaper to have people in the community than it is to keep them in a high security prison environment. And secondly, your second point about, somehow having the death penalty or having life without parole kind of handed out almost routinely for anyone who commits certain crimes. Well, that's what they do in the United States. That's why they've got 60,000 people serving life without parole. They have the death penalty in many US states. They have 2.5 million people in prison, many of them serving sentences of 100 years or 150 years, even if they haven't got life without parole. And does anyone sitting at home watching this program think that America is the safest place on earth as a result? Of course it's not. They have the highest level of violent crime on earth. They have vast levels of child murder, child abuse, child rape, and all the other serious crimes that are committed against children, despite the fact that you will often get the death penalty, and you certainly are likely to get life without parole if you commit those crimes. So the idea that you set these sentences and suddenly crime stops is just nonsense.
Well, you may say that, but first of all, the only cost you're measuring is the... Hang on, sorry, I've allowed you to speak. It's my turn now. I listened, I hear what you said, and now I will respond to those points that you made. Now, the first point, you talked about cost. Well, OK, if you only measure cost by money, then you may be partly true, but I'm measuring cost to society. I'm also measuring the cost of the people who that person will then go and affect after being released, and many of those people continue to go on committing the similar crimes which are unacceptable to the victims, who will therefore never ever recover from what has happened to them, because many of them may be killed or will have problems mentally because of what's happened to them. Secondly, you talked about life without parole, and I think that absolutely should be an option, because it'll probably mean that less people will go into prison because they might consider that they will never come out. And finally, you talked about America, and you said it's got all these numbers, and you quoted some statistics. Do you know how much bigger America is than the UK? It's huge. So you're not comparing like with like. And also, they have the right to bear arms. I absolutely think the death penalty should be considered. And in wake of the killing of this poor 6-year-old Arthur Labinjo Hughes as well, the Prime Minister has been talking about backing Arthur's Law, which would actually see people who murder children automatically jailed for their entire lives. And that's what I think should have happened to Jon Venables. So finally, I want to ask you then, should life sentence mean life behind bars?
No, of course it shouldn't. The idea that we end up having this system, I mean, you talk about America being bigger than us. It's 5 times bigger than us. Their population is 30 or 40 times bigger than ours, because they adopt this ridiculous policy that you're advocating of locking so many people up forever. And what happens is, when you do that, is that no one takes any notice. It doesn't stop people committing crime. It certainly wouldn't stop 10-year-olds going out and doing something seriously violent because of something they saw on the news about someone being sentenced. It's just not how the world works. If you're going to try and reduce crime, you have to stop these simplistic, jingoistic ideas about just getting ever tougher and tougher. We've been doing that for 25 years, and where have we got with it? What good has it done our society? I'll tell you, it's made it worse.
You think we've got tougher and tougher on crime, Chris Daw QC? I don't think so. Thank you very much for joining me. He's a barrister. Thank you very much for joining me. He's a barrister and author of Justice on Trial. Pleasure to talk to you.